Imagine two worlds, two sets of expectations, two battles for belonging. Black diaspora immigrants weave through this reality every day, juggling cultural echoes of home with the stark realities of American racism. When cultural identity, a shield against stress, gets battered, how do we help navigate its cracks? How do we also reserve space to help clients see their own strength and resolve? And can we, therapists and clients, celebrate our own cultural identities in a shared space, weaving a tapestry of deep appreciation? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Zen. Our guest today is Dr. Alexis Melville, a licensed clinical psychologist with extensive experience in leadership and multicultural clinical and training applications. She has dedicated her life to working with diverse populations, including developing an APA-accredited multicultural-focused internship and externship, forming the Black Faculty and Staff Alliance in response to pivotal societal events, developing cultural affirming mindfulness spaces at 3 universities, being featured on a panel discussing the intersection of mental health and gender identity, and was invited as an expert member on a dissertation committee based on expertise in adult children of immigrants. Dr. Melville's multiple roles have included being a director of training, a clinical director, and adjunct teacher. She has worked in a variety of settings, such as university counseling centers, hospitals, and community mental health clinics in the Caribbean and United States. Currently, Dr. Melville has a virtual private practice where she helps BIPOC young professionals, people who feel like outsiders, and adult children of immigrants increase self-esteem and authenticity. Additionally, Dr. Melville is a consultant for a nonprofit where she develops social emotional learning programming for adolescents of color on ways to increase self-esteem and confidence using strength-based and culturally relevant approaches. As a Black first-generation Caribbean immigrant, Dr. Melville will be discussing with us ways to emphasize growth as well-being amongst immigrant clients using existing cultural practices. Dr. Melville, thank you so much for being with us today.
Happy to be here. It's so weird to hear people read your bio, right? Because you never really, you're like, oh my goodness, I'm doing too much.
Yes, you are doing too much. Well, speaking of doing too much and how you got to doing too much, can you walk us through your journey and share with us any memorable events and circumstances that may have influenced how you got into this work?
Yes. So I am thinking the most memorable, I guess, incident would be coming to the United States at 7 years old. And so like kind of trying to navigate a space where there is this individualistic culture where I'm coming from a background where there was a lot of collectivism. Also, most of my family is back in Jamaica. That's where I'm immigrating from. My mom coming to this space and trying to navigate this whole world of the United States. And so I just remember having to be the translator at a very young age, right? Though I speak, like English is my first language, trying to translate to my mom, who's a single mom. We're in a low income area because we're immigrants. We don't know anything, right? And so trying to translate with her, what is racism? What are the different things that are happening? How the schooling in the Caribbean is mostly like British based, whereas in America it is, American based. So even when I first came to United States, I was placed in the ESL class, and I remember the teacher, yeah, because of I had a heavy accent, though I was speaking English, it's a heavy accent. And so the ESL teacher, oh, now it's called multilingual learners, but the ESL teacher was Jamaican, interestingly enough. And she's just like, what are you doing here? Why are you in this class? So I just think that I've had a a lifetime of trying to translate who I am and navigate various different spaces. And I wanted to be in a profession that's kind of like the crux of the profession, to be able to provide people with the language. And sorry, my voice is going in and out because I'm just coming up from having bronchitis for a month. So just let me
Oh.
know if you need me to repeat something. But
Mhm.
it's just a profession that is kind of part and parcel of like providing a language for people to understand themselves and understand others. And so that's what I've strived to do in all of the thousand things that I'm doing. The main theme is kind of creating a space that's not only safe, rather, but brave, and so that people can understand what's going on. Even my therapy, when I was doing counseling centers, like my therapy was kind of weird because I'd be like, listen, this is how you advocate for yourself in college. It's not rude for you to speak up in class. It's not rude for you to follow up with your professor. Actually, it's expected of you. So let's talk through like the nitty gritty and then also integrate like wellness. So that's been like my life goal based just on my personal experiences.
You've been really a champion of folks to be able to speak in a common way for themselves so
Hmm.
that they can get their needs met. Now, you centered on this profession because that's what speaks to you. How did
Hmm.
you actually find psychology? And I'm making this assumption based on a lot of guest speakers as well as my experience, which is, psychology was more of, serendipitous thing. We didn't know about it. Curious, how did you come to psychology?
Yeah, it was interesting. I think I'm actually the weird one in psychology because I'm like an undergrad psych major. I've been psych like through and through. And so the first time that I ever heard of what a psychologist was, I wanted to get into mediation. Like in my high school, you could get into like peer mediation or something like that. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but some high schools have that as a way, as a first step in before like expulsion. So I remember the first time it was a pilot program, and I was part of this mediation, and it was 9 people, 4 girls against 5 girls that got into like a physical fight, and it was me and I don't know who it was. I'm trying to remember some administrator because I couldn't like do it by myself because that would be unethical. So it was like me and another administrator, and I just remember being overwhelmed but like super excited, and I was like, how can I do this again? Like I loved like kind of coming up with a common goal, and like it was a really tense environment and being able to de-escalate, and I was just like, I need to do this all the time. And so I remember going to I went to somebody and they were like, oh, talk to the school psychologist. And so I talked to that person, and so they kind of told me like the different types of psychology. And so from there I was like, I need to just major in this. So I have been psychology like just all the time. I used to work in the grad psych office as an undergrad. Like I am a psych nerd like through and through.
I can really see a lot of connections that you are forming. In fact, is like as you are being a mediator, there's a sense of community that you are embedded in
Mhm.
this group, and it's that
Mhm.
cohesiveness that you're experiencing. The other part, just based on what you shared with me, your journey and this work,
Mhm.
which
Mhm.
is also the center of what we talk about in this podcast. You
Mhm.
mentioned bringing up or translating or describing racism to your mother at such a young age.
Mhm.
Can you share with me what that was like for you? And did
Mhm.
you mean that in a context of U.S. versus the Caribbeans?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question. What happens when one immigrates to the United States is that they inherit the history of the United States. And so, if you're coming from the Caribbean, for instance, it is 99% Black, right? And so, there isn't race as defined as starkly as it is in the United States. There is classism there. There is a bit of colorism, but the historical context of race within the United States is so embedded in every single aspect that it also influences how you interact, like how you interact with institutions, how institutions view you. So to make it just personal, when we first immigrated to the United States, I went to a predominantly Black elementary school that was very under resourced, like typical inner city school. And so for me, there was like a comfort level there, and I didn't really think about my race as much. However, there was a teacher who happened to be white actually. She spoke with my mom about how taxes influence the type of schools and the resources that schools get. So she encouraged us to move to the suburbs so that I could have the opportunities that I needed to have, right? And so moving to the suburbs, there is a opportunity, but there's also a loss, right? When you're going to a predominantly white school or a school, even when there's not predominantly white, there is a loss of community and understanding if you're in a school that's really homogeneic, right? And so some in America, unfortunately, better schools tend to mean more like white folks, right? And so that means you have to navigate a whole new culture. So there were different aspects that I was experiencing in like sixth grade, seventh grade around my abilities, what I could achieve, whether or not I should be in honors classes or not. But there was a tinge of racism underneath it. But my mom wouldn't pick up on that. But she just kept on saying that, why are people being unfair to you? You were in gifted classes in elementary school. Why all of a sudden now you're not achieved? Like that doesn't make any sense. So even now, the conversations haven't stopped because she's still trying to conceptualize what race and racism means, what it means to be Black in America. And so we constantly have conversations about race, what it's like for me to grow up with my context is the United States. Even though I was born in Jamaica, my context is the United States. So kind of having those conversations of like Blackness, what's racism, what's someone being unfair, like that's tied into a lot of isms, like really unpacking that. And because of, I don't want to generalize all immigrant like parents, but I want to say that with my mom and my family, education is everything, right? You are a lawyer or a doctor or engineer, period, right? So my mom's like, you go into school. I remember I was telling her I was like homesick, and she was like, you didn't go to school to make friends. You went to school to get AIDS. Like, who cares if you're homesick? Like, suck it up, read a book. So like, it's kind of those that. So for her, the context of race or racism is like you're getting too emotional, you're getting too caught up in nonsense, right? You need to achieve. So it's kind of it's a constant conversation. She's better at it now, but there is that piece around not understanding that language of like, how do you explain to someone like the history of racism in America, right? While you're also experiencing bias from, I would call out my guidance counselor who said that I couldn't make it because I'm not good in math, or I shouldn't apply to college because my people aren't good at math. Like those kinds of like aggressive comments, right? So it's been challenging to be that translator in that sense, because you're kind of trying to translate your pain to an immigrant mama who doesn't believe in like anything mental health or pain. She believes in grades and and benefits and a good government job. So it's kind of it's challenging, right? Even for me, being a full grown adult.
Yeah, it was like translating three ends, translating for yourself, of trying to
Mhm,
process what's happening within yourself, also
mhm,
being a translator for your mom to understand what's happening, as well as translating towards other people that you're interacting with. Wow, it
mhm,
is a lot of work that you're doing there.
mhm,
Now,
mhm,
there's something instrumental about your message that I think we want to highlight, because oftentimes when we think about the immigrant experience, associated with hardships, trauma, the challenges that immigrants go through.
sure.
However, I think that loses sight on the whole experience, which is why you've talked about trying to emphasize growth and well-being with immigrant clients using existing cultural practices. And I think that's
Mhm,
sort of maybe some contention there because, for instance, maybe a cultural practice or a cultural belief system is that you study, 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 and you fight all odds by working hard. But that doesn't
mhm,
work, or it's hard when you're faced with racist structures. And
mhm, mhm,
so
mhm.
I'm wondering, can you tell me more about this message that you want to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I believe in there's this. adage that I've been hearing, like the generational trauma, which I don't want to I don't want to minimize that, right? Because the generational trauma is very real. And I also think there are generational strengths that are passed down, right? So what I do is that I ask questions in a way that not only uncovers the trauma, but there are other aspects to being an immigrant that is joyful, right? Like my use of humor is part and parcel of, is part of my, how I communicate with my family, how I communicate with other folks that may be from the African diaspora. When I'm with my clients, I am goofy, they're laughing, we're laughing. And then we also get a chance to unpack as well, utilizing the music, the messages. There's a lot of, I would say, in like, say, reggae and dance hall and like soca and all these different types of genres throughout the African diaspora, Afro beats. There's this piece around family, around pride in who you are. So even if it's working hard, it is working hard so that your community can be better, so that you can help others, so that you can build a bridge for others. People tend to immigrate to this country not for themselves, right? They're immigrating because they want to, most of the time, in the, I would say, for the African diaspora and my personal family, it is to help those back home, right? So it is kind of this piece around family and community, because that actually helps to strengthen our resolve and strengthen, and I think it's also like, it's not like evidence based, but a buffer against racist acts, right? And so I think asking the questions around what has helped. So even if, like with wellness and mindfulness, if I say to someone, okay, I want you to take some deep breaths, they're gonna look at me like I'm crazy. They're like, what am I doing this for? Right? But if I say, you know, when you are laughing or when you are connecting with others and you go, ooh, cha, that's a deep breath, right? So it's kind of like they contextualizing it for people, that there are built in ways in a collectivistic society, there is room for wellness, but in individualistic societies, there's not as much. So for instance, I'm thinking of, on Sundays, my mom's friends will probably pull up in the driveway, knock on the door, and we share food. Or like even in the Caribbean, like I can walk where my dad is from, Trinidad and Tobago. Remember I was walking with like a suitcase, and this guy was like, "Hey, you want to ride to the airport?" And I was like, "Whoa, stranger danger!" But it's not like that in Tobago, where it's like, "No, you're walking on the road. Of course, I'm gonna put down my coffee and like drive you to the airport. Like, you need help." So there's like this built-in community that also our parents and ourselves have lost because we have made that transition. So what happens in the United States is that my mom's friends are now my aunties and uncles. So and like it's so much so that even in Connecticut, there's like a Jamaican, I guess, the society, if you will, but like people who know other Jamaicans will like be like, oh yeah, so and so from back home, let's get together and do X, Y, and Z, right? So I think that community aspect is actually very, very important for folks of immigrant backgrounds, whether it is African diaspora or other folks. Like that sense of community is so important. And so given the pandemic that has happened, that's kind of like cut us off from that. And so kind of thinking of how do we create community within ourselves when we can't do community, right? And so what do we say to ourselves? How do we nourish ourselves? Or how do we integrate maybe some older spiritual practices, maybe some like speaking to ancestors or those kinds of pieces to help nourish ourselves while we are in the process of curating community.
Yeah. There's a bit of sadness and hope that I'm,
Mm,
feeling as you're sharing this,
mm,
some personal reactions, which is, being in the US, it's hyper individualism, capitalism, the isms,
mm,
and people are moving for jobs, getting away from their roots. And so the decisions aren't based on community. They're not rooted in community.
mm,
And so when you're
mhm,
thinking about working with clients, it's almost as though you're recapturing that sense
mhm,
of, hey, what is it like to build and create a community and
mhm,
to really exercise that muscle again?
Right.
and to
Right.
feel what it's
Right.
like to be connected. Because, I mean, even though you're saying that, well, there's no data on this, but data does say social support is a huge
Mm-hmm.
buffer for
Mm-hmm.
depression and anxiety and a lot of mental health conditions. It's just that
Very true.
our systems aren't really set up in an ideal way for community interactions. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Now, what else would you like to share about your work and your practice?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that have helped me in all of the work that I've done in places where I've had privileged identities and marginalized identities is just the ability to be flexible and to listen and to ask the question, right? Like ask how how is this what is this like for you? Or how has, maybe your parents' immigrant stories impacted you and how you kind of show up? How are there ways that we can be flexible around what community looks like? Community for your so I'm thinking of like first gen, second gen immigrant folks. How community looks for like your parents are going to be different than how community looks for you being first or second gen. So how can we be flexible in what that looks like? It can be through TikTok, it could be through Instagram, or it could be through actual like connections. And so giving folks an opportunity to really explore and just ask the questions that our clients don't necessarily want to say, but sometimes like creating that affirming space means asking those questions. How are you sleeping? How are you feeling? What is it like to date and have this identity? What is it like to be a parent and have this identity? Are there fears or concerns or things you want to pass on to your kids? Are there certain fears or concerns in your head around parenting? Like kind of looking at the person holistically. That has helped in all aspects of my clientele, right? Like folks who don't have an immigrant background and folks who do. Just having that, asking those questions and being open around the answers and saying, hey, I'm here to join with you. I may not know what it is like to be XYZ person, but I'm here to hold space so that you can explore what that means for you outside of the the definitions that society has placed. So those are like
Mm,
like my main, I guess, tips, if you will. And that's how I kind of conduct therapy when I'm teaching class, when I'm like doing trainings. That's kind of like my intentions when I go into a space.
yeah, yeah. You also mentioned this XYZ identity. And so I'm thinking
Mhm.
about, would you approach it directly? Like, if you, let's say, immigrant, a Black immigrant, Asian immigrant, do you, in the therapy room, would you say, what is it like as an Asian immigrant to be faced with racism here in America? I'm just actually curious. Do you name it for them? How do you broach it?
I think it depends on the client, but I would say say for instance, like Asian immigrants, I would ask I'd ask more about their background, not only what country they're from, but what the country their family's from, but like what type of area is it? Rural, urban? What are the messages that they've received as a family being back home? Like how are they seen? How are their families seen? And then how does that translate to being in the United States? And then also kind of like unpacking like what how their experience has been, right? Because it's different if you're from, like, this was use United States. It's different if you're from like East Texas versus like Austin versus like Dallas, right? Like there's a different lived experience, right? So just kind of like really helping people to unpack that. Sometimes there's I think I and other people are used to kind of being like, okay, you're black, right? But there's nuance beneath that, right? So kind of like asking the questions and kind of getting to that nuance and being open to hearing it. So for instance, I use the example of like myself and my husband. Though we're both Caribbean, he's from Trinidad and Tobago. My family's from Jamaica. This is very different. It's different how we like speak, how we cook, how we think about things. Like it is different, right? Because there's a giant Indian influence in Trinidad and Tobago. I've had to learn to make like rotis and all these curries and all kinds of things. But like people wouldn't necessarily know that. They're like, oh, you're both black, la la la, right? And so kind of looking at the nuance, even people's families within their cultures are different. Family culture is different than what's going on. So just really giving people the opportunity to voice and to dig deep, and knowing that maybe your clients don't know that. Maybe they haven't thought about like racism or anything like that. So it's just really just providing space for what comes up. So depending on if they have kind of thought about it, I'll probably ask more poignant questions. But most of the time, I'll just be exploratory. But if I see people are kind of like hedging, then I'll be like, okay, so what is this like, right? So say for instance, if someone with one of my with clients that are say gender diverse and they're in the process of transition, I ask about like their sex life. What is that like? Are you experiencing pleasure? Are you experiencing like, and they typically be like, oh my gosh, nobody has asked that. Oh my gosh, I want to talk more about this because I'm having some difficulties, especially with the hormones, what that looks like, etc. What feels good to me, what doesn't, like those kinds of things. So I just want to create a space for people to be open to kind of exploring. And sometimes my clients aren't there yet, so that's okay. We'll just explore what they need from me.
Wow. Wow. Well, thanks for sharing those tips. And so, Dr. Melville, this is a question I ask everyone on the podcast, which you've already spoken to quite a bit. I don't know if there's additional things you want to add, and that is in your career as a person of color, what were some challenges that you faced and overcame that you would be willing to share?
Oh yeah, I had to do a whole talk on this with my grad students.
Okay, okay.
There's a whole thing on that. So I'll give you the TikTok version. But I would say just really trying to trust in myself. I think my experiences being in grad programs is that piece around not understanding the language. I felt like when I first went into my master's program in experimental psych, it felt like everybody was like speaking another language because I'm not used to how people, it almost seemed like people knew what to say or how to respond, or like even in my PsyD program when we were kind of exploring how to approach a client, I was like, I felt like people were being invasive with their questions, but people felt so like comfortable asking the questions, and it just seemed like people had a way of speaking to each other, like, oh, I'm curious about blah blah blah. Like I don't speak like that, so I had to like learn the language of grad school, and I was like, what is this? And so being around folks that had similar experiences to myself, whether it was immigrant background or being a person of color, helped me to realize that, oh, I'm not the only one that doesn't speak this language, right? I think how I've overcome it is kind of like staying true to myself and kind of redefining what my North Star is, my why of why do I do this? Why do I continue to persevere? That sometimes people react to me and sometimes people react to the idea of me because, as they say, like racism and inequity is in the groundwater, right? Like it is everywhere. So sometimes I have to take a step back and be like, okay, this is not me, this is a system happening, so I can then kind of divorce myself from that, from the outcome in a way. So I'll give an example. So there are times in grad school where other people would get certain opportunities just based on being able to speak a certain language, looking a certain way. And so I start to internalize that as, oh, there's something wrong with me. I'm not really that great of a clinician. And so kind of looking back at connecting with mentors and then talking through, okay, what am I doing? Who am I? What kind of impact am I having? And who am I at my core? And really revisiting that at all aspects of my career. And so really taking the stuff that I tell my clients and applying it to myself. And I don't know if I've overcome it, but I in a space where I'm trying to settle within myself, if that makes sense. So I'm just kind of constantly defining and redefining myself so that whatever comes my way, I can know, okay, that is me, or versus like, oh, that's not me, that's somebody else's stuff. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, no, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm here nodding if people can see, the language is so huge. Like literally
Mhm.
the language. People are saying, I'm curious, I'm wondering. I don't talk like
Yeah.
that. You know, I remember in supervision,
Yeah.
supervisors, I'm wondering about this. Why don't you just be blunt and just ask me, why did you do this? What's going on? You know? Now I understand why it can
Exactly.
be accusational, you know, however, just it's a hey, you're doing this, tell me what's going on. I appreciate a little
Exactly.
bit more of that.
Yes.
'Cause,
Yes.
the wondering, curious, you know, I understand occasional curious, but the wondering that gets overused sometimes. Yeah, wow,
Right.
wow, so but it's like for you, you're describing a process where you're constantly I wouldn't say redefining yourself necessarily because you have an
Mhm.
idea of your core self. It's almost as though you're fleshing out what the world or external environment is throwing at you, and you're just trying to decipher what part makes sense for me, what part do I see as
Mhm.
something I want to incorporate and still make it my
Mhm.
own.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes.
Mm,
That's true. Yes, I agree with that. Yeah, for
yeah,
sure.
yeah. Is there anything else you like to share with us?
Because in addition to therapy, I do consultation, supervision, and like I'm trying to do some coaching around like just being a leader and what that's like, especially if you're the first. So whether you're first generation, first in the family, first one to get a job with a title, first one to move out of your town, right? And because there's a piece around imposter syndrome kind of creeps up, but it has a different texture when those aspects are there. So I'm doing some coaching around that, but most of the like, so yeah, I'm open for clients as well as consultations, and also I'm developing a leadership coaching thing because again I do too many things. I'm a true Jamaican. I have like many jobs. But I like to have variety. So that's what's happening, and I'm happy to talk with anyone. And folks that know me know that I like to talk to people and help them, and whatever concerns they have. So
Great, great. Well, thank you very much for your time. Any other final thoughts?
thank you. I just really appreciate our conversation and the opportunity to be in a platform where people can relate to others and not feel so alone. Because this field can really gaslight us. And so I just appreciate your platform and just the invitation and just the opportunity. So I'm expressing gratitude.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you like what you've heard, please share and subscribe to our podcast, People of Color and Psychology. Other ways to support us include registering for continuing education courses or making a donation on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. We value your input and appreciate your continued support. You can send us an email, a message on LinkedIn, or send us a voice message on our website. Until next time, this is your host, Jack Sun.